The following program is part of a college course. These telecourses allow you to earn college credits at home. For more information, contact a college or university near you.
A botanical garden is a place of quiet beauty, a place where visitors, both young and old, can enjoy nature's delicate colors, sounds, and fragrances. A kind of living classroom where plants, fungi, and animals coexist in guarded tranquility. Botanical gardens are also increasingly important as repositories, safe harbors where scientists can protect rare and endangered plants against the ever-present threat of extinction. Like curators at many small botanical gardens, Dr. Larry Beasley and his associates at Quail Gardens work hard to meet scientific and aesthetic needs.
We are 30 acres, of which approximately 2/3 is developed as a cultivated garden. Most of our displays are perennial, and they're geared more towards actual botany, showing things in their geographical locations as much as possible.
In this idyllic setting, it's possible to explore the major developments or branch points that occurred in land plants as they made the evolutionary transition from the water-based environment of green algae to a more terrestrial habitat.
The earliest descendants of the land plants included the liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. Liverworts include things like Marcantia, which has basically a flat plane of cells instead of individual leaves.
A major evolutionary challenge for plants was to develop an adequate surface for an air environment. Over time, hornworts, then mosses, evolved, and those plants featured leaf-like structures with a new protective surface called cuticle.
Cuticle is composed of a substance called cutin, which is very impervious to water. And the cuticle was necessary to prevent water loss. And so that was a major innovation that allowed plants, in this case green plants, to invade the land.
The cuticle was impermeable to both water and air, so it required an additional adaptation of the surface, pores for gas exchange, known as stomata.
The earliest land plants, including descendants of those, the liverworts, lack stomates, but actually hornworts and mosses have them. And those were retained into the plants that we see around us today.
Once the plant's surface had a new design, land plants could grow in size and move even further from water. But to do so, they had to solve the additional problems of moving water from one part of the plant to another and providing physical support in a non-buoyant environment. As it turned out, both problems had a single solution: vascular tissues composed of xylem and phloem.
Xylem and phloem, of course, are specialized conductive cells that are arranged end to end and form a tube. They very efficiently conduct water and mineral nutrients and sugars. Now you have the capability of evolving, large ferns and the big trees we see around us.
Perhaps most important in the evolution and classification of land plants are changes in reproductive patterns. Land plants have two distinct forms that alternate in a repeating cycle called alternation of generation. In this cycle, the diploid spore-producing plant, or sporophyte, alternates with the haploid gamete-producing plant, or gametophyte.
Gametophytes need moisture. Often, the haploid sperm must swim or be washed to the female egg. Fertilization doubles the chromosome number to diploid. This stimulates the growth of a new sporophyte.
When mature, cells of the sporophyte use meiosis to divide and form haploid spores. Spores that reach a moist, favorable environment grow into new gametophytes, and the cycle begins again. Land plants originated from ancestral algae that were mostly haploid. Early non-vascular land inhabitants and their relatives, such as mosses, established the sporophyte stage.
All mosses have stems and leaves, but keep in mind these stems and leaves are gametophytic tissue. The sporophyte's a capsule arising from the gametophyte.
As evolutionary time progresses, the balance shifts from gametophyte dominance in mosses to sporophyte dominance in flowering plants. Pollen is all that remains of the gametophyte. In the middle are the early vascular plants represented by horsetails and ferns, in which both stages are independent plants.
The gametophyte of these plants is very small, more like a moss or a liverwort, in fact, in stature and size. Very short-lived. That's the phase of the life cycle that contains the gametes, the egg and the sperm.
Where enough moisture is present for spores to remain viable and germinate, forming gametophytes, then for flagellated sperm to swim to eggs forming new sporophytes, ferns continue to thrive. However, without that moisture, new adaptations are needed for species to survive. One adaptation in plants that allows them to conquer this problem of environmental variation is the seed. The seed can lay dormant for long periods, then spring to life when conditions are favorable.
All of the seed plants consist of really 5 major lineages, and 4 of these have traditionally been called gymnosperms.
Gymnosperm means naked seed, referring to the fact that the seeds are released from cones without a surrounding fruit or flower.
The cycads are, when they're smaller plants, might look more fern-like. As they get larger, they look more palm-like, and in fact are called sago palms. They are actually cone-bearing as well, however. They're definitely more primitive, and they've been around a long time.
Among the gymnosperms, the ginkgo is a remarkable species, with only one member having survived extinction.
The ginkgo has a broad leaf, unlike the pine tree. It has a very distinctive shaped leaf that looks like the tiny leaflet of a maidenhair fern. No other tree has a leaf like that. It has also a branching pattern that is unique.
The main thing that we associated with gymnosperms is this 3rd lineage, the conifers. That's a very large group of seed plants, which include things like pine trees, spruce, hemlock, Douglas fir, etc. Then we have this group called the Nitales, which are the closest living relatives to the flowering plants. The 5th group within the seed plants were the angiosperms, the flowering plants.
Angiosperm means vessel seed and refers to modified flower parts that surround seeds and later form fruits.
And most of the flowers we're familiar with are brightly colored. They have brightly colored petals, for example, basically that attract some pollinator, some animal usually, to come to the flower and transport the pollen from one flower to another.
The same structure that attracts pollinators attracts human admirers as well, both to botanical gardens and to the study of plants in general. To protect this varied and colorful kingdom is vital.
Extinction is a very real thing. Extinction's occurring now at a rate unprecedented in the Earth's history, greater than ever occurred in the Earth's history, even with the extinction of the dinosaurs. And this is alarming, so we have to be aware of what's happening and try to prevent it, both for aesthetic reasons, for scientific reasons, and for our own survival.
The primal forest teems with life and with death. Hidden below the forest floor are agents that thrive by transforming decaying organic materials into life-supporting nutrients. Here live yeasts, molds, and mushrooms, organisms known as fungi.
If we didn't have fungi breaking down plant components, it would be piling up sky high in no time at all. Most of the soil food chains, food webs, are based about half on fungi, half on bacteria.
As a food source, fungi are consumed in many forms. Humans like the mushroom, a delicacy that for centuries has been picked wild or grown in dank caves. Only recently have entrepreneurs like Bob Crouch grown mushrooms on a commercial basis.
We grow what is commonly referred to as a white button mushroom. Technically, it's called Agaricus bisporus.
The mushroom represents only a small part of the fungal organism. It's the reproductive package that holds the spore while rising to an appropriate height, then releases that spore to the world.
The basic body plan of a fungus can be of two main types. One type would be a single cell called a yeast, and the second type would be a filamentous structure of one cell sort of on top of another.
Fungi are composed of simple filamentous cells which mat together to form visible parts of the organism. For mushrooms, a loose web under the soil forms the main body, or mycelium. A tighter grouping forms the more familiar cap and stalk of the reproductive body.
In nature, you don't see single strands of fungi. Usually what you get are groups of strands of fungi organized into a mycelium.
Although they may appear to survive in the same way as the plants around them, fungi do not generate energy through photosynthesis. So while fungi look like one kingdom, they actually have more in common with another.
They're much more similar to animals than they are to plants. Their feeding mode is very animal-like. Their storage products are glycogen, which is the same as animal storage product, as opposed to starch, which is a plant storage product.
In the wild, fungi release enzymes that break down or decay organic materials into the nutrients they need to survive. And on a mushroom farm, this organic stew must be supplied.
The essence of growing mushrooms is making compost. It takes approximately 3 semi-loads of straw to make compost for one house, and that becomes the compost for one room of mushrooms.
The compost is then loaded into the beds and planted with mycelium spawn. A warm, humid environment is maintained for the next 2 weeks as the mycelium bed develops into a thick mat. When the time is right, Crouch mimics nature by dropping the temperature. This stimulates opposing filaments to join, forming the fruiting bodies we know as mushrooms.
We drop the temperature 20 degrees. Shocking it with temperature causes it to form little nodules that become pins, and 10 days later that pin is a full-grown mushroom.
Most commercially grown mushrooms are picked before they reach reproductive maturity, that is, before they release their spores.
A spore is a little packet of a fungus. It's usually a few microns in size and is walled off. Spores are produced by the millions, billions, and even trillions by individual fungi.
Of the billions of spores released by a single fungal bud, only those able to locate a proper source of nutrients are likely to survive. Although some fungi may harm other organisms in their quest for nutrients, others are helpful.
Fungi get a bad rap sometimes for being horrible pathogens and causing our toes to itch and killing our plants and that sort of thing. But they also do many positive things in ecosystems. And one of the most important is mycorrhizal symbiosis.
In this symbiotic relationship, the fungus obtains carbon compounds from the roots of the plant, while it processes nitrogen, phosphorus, and trace minerals for its host. Other beneficial fungi include molds that help produce useful products like cheeses and medicines such as penicillin and other antibiotics. But what most concerns Bob Crouch is the business of supplying a quality product for the dinner table.
There's 1,000 points in the growing process at which you could goof up and hurt your crop. And that is where the risk comes in. When everything goes right, it's a very good business, but it is not for the faint of heart.
The diversity of the animal world is amazing. In fact, of the Earth's 1.5 million species, over 2/3 are multicellular animals. Such diversity is almost beyond comprehension without first classifying animals as parts of organizational groups.
The animal kingdom is divided into subgroups called phyla, and the phyla tend to be distinguished from one another by a series of what we think of as branching points or innovations that will separate one group of organisms from another group of organisms.
If one wants to go down the tree of life, I think there are several important events. One event was the creation of the multicellular animals, this progression from single cell to multicell.
Sponges, the simplest multicellular animals, developed in the sea. These unique animals are of the phylum Porifera, a name that refers to their porous nature. Unlike all other animals, sponges have cells that function independently. That is, they don't work together as groups of tissues.
The first stage in the progression is between animals that lack organized tissues and distinct organs versus those that have them. And on the one side you have the sponges, and then on the other side you have animals that have distinct tissues and also distinct organs. Your second branching point is the difference between organisms that have radial symmetry versus bilateral symmetry. An animal with radial symmetry is one that has a center and an outside. It's organized like a wheel with spokes on a wheel, or like a flower with petals on the flower. If you have an animal that's bilaterally symmetric, it means that it has a distinct right side and left side, and each side would be a mirror image of the other.
The radially symmetrical phylum Cnidaria includes jellyfish and sea anemones and is named after the stinging cells all members possess. Cnidaria also have a hollow bag-like shape with a central digestive cavity, as well as 2 simple tissue layers, as opposed to the 3 layers found in the later phyla.
When you have 3 different cell layers, then that usually is associated with a considerable increase in the complexity of how the animal is organized. That middle cell layer turns out to be associated with movement. So the idea is that the animals with bilateral symmetry have a tendency to be much more active and capable of moving around and manipulating their environment in a way that animals with radial symmetry do not have.
Flatworms are the simplest of the bilateral phyla, which includes parasitic forms like flukes and tapeworms, as well as many free-living forms. Flatworms have progressed to the next level of organization, with prominent digestive, reproductive, nervous, and excretory organs. Conspicuously absent, however, is a body cavity, or coelom. The coelom is only partially developed in the next phylum, roundworms, which include parasites and soil-dwelling nematodes.
The presence of a fluid-filled cavity has the effect of sort of cushioning the internal organs of the animal. In a way, it's sort of like a large shock absorber.
Simpler jellyfish and flatworms have a pouch for a digestive tube with a single in and out opening. More complex animals are distinguished by a complete tube which goes entirely through the organism, forming both a mouth and an anus. In the embryonic stage, this complete tube forms in one of two ways, based on the position of the first opening that occurs as the embryo folds, or gastrulates.
In one group of organisms, that opening will become the head end of the animal and develop into the mouth, and those are called the protostomes. The second group, that will become the tail end of the organism, and it will develop into the anus or the cloaca, and those are referred to as the deuterostomes.
This developmental difference establishes the two major divergent pathways in the animal kingdom.
The key thing is that both branches continue to evolve and to change. The protostomes include the insects and the arthropods, which are by far the most diverse and successful group of organisms, whereas the deuterostomes include the vertebrates, which are perhaps less successful in many regards. There is no criteria that one could use to describe one or the other as being either more complex than the other. They just simply have followed different paths in their evolutionary history.
As scientists studied the branching pathways up the protosome line from the roundworms, they've been surprised by what newer techniques have revealed about these intricate relationships.
The evolution of organisms is often thought of as being the evolution from a simple organism to a more complex organism. But that's not always the case. For example, it's long been thought that the arthropods, which are complex-looking animals that include things like insects and include crustaceans, it's thought that they were evolved from simpler animals like annelids and mollusks, because annelids look simple. Well, when we looked at the ribosomal RNA sequences, the first thing we realized is this is not the way it is. First, arthropods gave rise to a branch, and this branch then gave rise to both the annelids and the mollusks. So I think the lesson to be learned is simple isn't always first. Sometimes you can take a complex organism and simplify it and evolve to something else more important.
The careful study of life's diversity reveals other lessons as well. A feature currently provoking controversy is segmentation, or repeating body units.
There's some dispute about whether or not segmentation is a feature that evolved independently several times, and one argument is that the annelids and the arthropods and the vertebrates all independently derived this segmented organization. On the other hand, we're finding that the actual genes that are responsible for segmentation are the same in all organisms, and it suggests that segmentation may actually be a more common theme than we imagine, and may in fact have a common origin.
To scientists, echinoderms present a kind of puzzle. While the phylum includes things like sea urchins and sea stars that exhibit radial symmetry, echinoderms are more closely classified to humans than they are to other wheel-like organisms, such as jellyfish.
The reason is that you have to consider the whole life cycle of the echinoderm, and it turns out that the echinoderms have three different cell layers that are formed early in development. They're deuterostomes, they have a coelom, and then the final puzzle is that they have larvae that are very often bilaterally symmetric. So even though the adults look like the adults of a much more primitive organism, like the jellyfish, other features of the morphology in the life cycle say that their affinities are closest with the chordates.
Chordata is the most developed phylum on the deuterostome line. All members have features like a notochord, a gelatinous support rod down the back and paired throat slits at least in the embryo. These features are found in simpler chordates, as well as in the more specialized vertebrate subphylum, which includes hardened skeletal elements that protect the brain. Fishes developed paired fins to enhance their mobility at about the same time they developed a jaw that permitted them to hunt and feed more effectively.
You should think of jaws and paired fins as being a package deal, structures that evolved in concert with one another to create an animal that was different from its predecessors. The next major innovation that we see was the modification of these paired fins to become limbs.
As vertebrates moved away from water, they developed enhanced ways to prevent drying, to exchange gases, to circulate blood, and of course, to move.
An interesting feature about the amphibians and the way locomotion is coordinated through the trunk of the body is really essentially the same as a fish. The body is sort of rocking from one side to the other as a fish would. In the case of mammals, the vertebral column will flex towards the belly side and then towards the back side. They flex in a vertical plane, which means that the vertebral column is actually contributing to the limbs reaching forward to grab the land underneath and then propelling the animal forward through the environment.
So life continues to develop and change, from bacteria to paramecia, to pansies, penicillium, and pandas. The immense diversity of the living world is astounding, and the potential for new observations is ever present, not just because the science of classification is a dynamic and changing field, but because organisms continue to evolve and diversify. That's simply the nature of life.